You are listening to SeeThroughPanel, the comic book discussion podcast. My name is Cole Harvey. I'm here with Fahed Rahman.
Hello.
And today we have a very special episode and a very special guest. We are here with François Vigneault, creator of the book Titan that we just reviewed a couple months ago. François, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing really well. How are you guys?
Oh, doing great. Very excited to talk to you today. So I'm going to do a quick introduction. I'm sure you can tell me more, but here's what I have. So François is a freelance cartoonist, illustrator, and designer, not necessarily in that order. He is the creator of the graphic novel Titan, published in French by Pow Pow and soon to be released by Oni Press. I believe the date for that is November 2nd, François?
November 10th.
Fahed, why don't you introduce the book a bit before we get into the...
When manager Yao De Silva is sent to Homestead Station on the moon of Titan, he finds himself in the simmering tensions between genetically engineered Titan workers and the Terran management. Will the Union representative Macintosh be an ally, an enemy, or something else? Armed only with his intellect and the aid of his powerful eye device, Yao must work against the clock to discover what is going on before it tears the station apart and ignites a conflict that could change the face of the solar system. So that's Titan. I think both myself and Cole really enjoyed the book, and kind of like our opening question, Francois, is what is it like launching a book during kind of COVID-19 lockdown? I imagine it must be kind of a bit different to what you were expecting.
Right. Well, it definitely affected it. The book, as you noted, it's coming out November 10th, and it originally was supposed to be coming out in originally before COVID, it was supposed to be coming out in spring, and then after COVID-19, it was supposed to be coming out in September. So everything's delayed, and then that also means that I can't do, store signings and comic book conventions and things like that. But at the same time, I feel really lucky. It hasn't affected me too much. So I'm lucky in that the book's coming out. I feel really excited that it's coming out at this moment. But definitely, COVID definitely put a damper on some of the plans.
And in terms of the actual launch of the book, have you got any events planned? Is it going to be like a virtual book launch or?
I bet we will do some different things. We're talking with some different stores and things like that right now. It's still a little early. We're recording this a little bit before the book comes out, so I don't have all the we don't have everything lined up. But I know I'll be doing some stuff because I like to do it.
Okay,
awesome.
Cool.
So for the book itself, I had a couple questions about your process. I think I can tell it's worked digitally. But I'm also wondering, do you work with like a full script? Do you script at all, being a writer, illustrator? What's your process like for that?
Sure. So just on the first question, digital, it is a digital book, although the first 2 or 3 chapters were drawn analog, like on a ink on paper. And then I sort of switched my technique to being all digital after that. Because it just saved me a lot of time, and I did a lot of edits and things like that in digital, so I prefer to work that way. And then as far as my working process, I don't really work from a script. The book was very improvisational. I had the concept for the book. I had some different little scenes that I wanted, and I knew basically where I wanted it to end. But I didn't have all the beats. In fact, there were like major elements of the characters' story arcs, like what, different things that happened that I had no idea were going to happen until I was actually working on it. So I would often, I would write down, what I wanted the characters to say, or I would sort of thumbnail things out, kind of thumbnail out the pages and be like, okay, well, what can happen in a chapter of 16 pages? X, Y, Z can happen. But I very rarely had a script, where I would say, Phoebe says this, Joao says this, and then this happens. I wouldn't tend to write it that way.
Okay, is that traditional for you? Sorry, Fed.
Yeah,
is that
Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
Is that the process normally for most of your books? I know you've worked with writers before, but on books that you make by yourself, is that kind of the norm for you?
That is the norm for me. I've tried writing scripts before, but I haven't had. It doesn't come as naturally to me. It's easier for me to kind of do my thumbnails and the writing. Sometimes I'll for instance, I'll be drawing out my little thumbnail or my little pencil pages, and I'll know that the person has to say something, so I'll draw the little word balloon, but I don't know exactly what they're going to say. But I know that they're going to be discussing some sort of thing. I'll draw it, and then it's kind of like as I'm going along, I'll improvise the dialogue, or I'll speak the lines to myself and kind of come up with the replies, the back and forth. And then also sometimes, and you probably noticed that the book is on a grid. It's always 3 tiers, almost always through the whole book. And one of the reasons I do that is that allows me to edit the book much more easily than if it was, full splash pages or different layouts for every page. Because here I can, if I find like a panel isn't working, or if the pacing of a scene is wrong, I can add or subtract panels, move things around, and then I don't have to end up redrawing everything. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I find that because I write comic books myself, so like for me to, I'm really curious about what other creators process is, and kind of like it's fascinating to hear kind of like you don't, because like as a writer I kind of like I start off with the dialogue, because I'm kind of very aware that the real estate on a comics page is kind of like limited, so I'm just I'm constantly thinking, what's the minimum amount of words I can use to kind of tell the story. So it's really interesting that you kind of you start off with the visuals, and then you kind of you fill in the dialogue later on. And I think both myself and Cole found like the dialogue was one of the stronger. Well, all parts of the book were really good, but I especially found kind of like the dialogue and the interaction between the characters like really believable. So it's interesting that almost came after you'd sketched out the thumbnails.
Oh, well, that's great to hear from a writer. And I'm glad you guys enjoyed that element of the book. Yeah, I mean, they kind of go hand in hand. It's not like a lot. If you were to see the way my pencils look, they're really raw. They're really rough. I don't. A lot of the art that you see, I don't do like a traditional penciling and inking the way, with the way like say a Marvel comic used to be made, where I do these perfect pencil drawings, and then I do my perfect inks over the pencil drawings. My pencils, which I call pencils, but even though it's digital, my pencils are very loose. Like the faces are really raw. It's just mostly just to block out the scenes, kind of block out where the people are, and then then it's kind of like as I'm developing that and the dialogue kind of get developed back and forth in tandem, and then I keep tweaking it all the way to the end. I'll change the dialogue even after everything's drawn, because I'll feel that something should be said differently, and vice versa too. Sometimes I'll realize I have like a reaction or a line from someone that demands a different kind of drawing, and so I'll redo the drawing because the person's expression doesn't work, or the way they're looking doesn't work with regards to what they're saying.
Wow. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's very improvisational creation there, which I think comes through in the dialogue, because you kind of want that dialogue to be a bit improvisational and kind of natural and flowing. That really came across in the book. That's very interesting that you work that way.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I kind of like with the artists that I've worked with, I think that's something you can kind of do as a solo creator. If I'd done that with some of the teams that I've been with, I'm not too sure I'd still be on speaking terms with some of the artists, because it's kind of, so you want me to go back and redraw everything and then do the, yeah. So yeah, it must be nice to kind of like have that freedom to sort of create that way as a solo creator.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, as the sole creator of Titan, I mean, I collaborated with some people who did some of the some little technical things for me, but as the sole creator, I really could decide for myself where I wanted to take the story. I do work with other writers, and it is interesting. It's they and they're all different. Some of the writers, they give a script. Other writers, I have one, my second book that came out in French. It's not in English, and it won't be for a little while, but it was called 13th Avenue, and the author, whose name is Genevieve Peterson, she wrote it in prose format. So she wrote like basically a 25-page short story in prose format, and then my job was to adapt that into a graphic novel format. And so it ended up being like 160 pages of comics. And that was really interesting too, because she would write things, not only was there the internal monologue of the character, but she would write things about like how things smelled and things like that. And that's very hard to to get
Yeah,
across in a
yeah,
comic book.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that was really fun. It was, I often liken that to being that's like being the director of the movie, right?
yeah.
Like the screenwriter has written the script, and then you as the artist are, because I had a lot of flexibility in how I adapted that. So, that was my job.
Yeah, that's kind of very sort of the first comic I did with my friend John. That's pretty similar. I gave him like a film script, and he just kind of went off and adapted it. And there's no kind of like formal comic book script format, so it's kind of everyone's got their own process anyway. So let's talk a little bit about the book. I think music is a theme that kind of runs throughout the book, kind of the central relationship between Yao and
Phoebe.
Phoebe McIntosh are, that's kind of built on their love of kind of like similar songs, and each chapter is based on the title of a song. So I just wanted to kind of wanted you to talk a little bit about why you made the decision to have music such a central part of the story, and how you went about choosing which songs to include and that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. Well, music from the Titan is the story. I mean, it's a big story. There's a lot of, it's a big / small story. It's fairly intimate, but it kind of has a wide scope. But the main heart of it, I think, is this relationship between two people who come from different worlds. And I mean that both figuratively and literally. Like, one is from the Earth, one is from Titan, but also one is, poor, working class. The other is coming from, a privileged background on the Earth. One's a man, one's a woman, obviously. One is a Titan, one is a Terran. So they're really different from each other. And I was thinking about like ways that these characters could connect. And one way I thought that the characters could connect, because it's a way I've connected with a lot of people throughout my life, is just through music. Music, I feel like, is something that kind of can sometimes cut across cultures. You don't have to speak, the characters in my book speak the same language, but you don't even necessarily need to speak the same language to listen to music. Music has definitely been an introduction for me into lots of different cultures. And so that was the reason that music ended up being sort of a through line and a metaphor in a way in the book about these characters' connection. And then that allowed me also to kind of seek inspiration through music, through lyrics, through song titles. As you mentioned, all the chapter titles are based on a song. And I guess another thing I should mention is that all the music in Titan is set 200 years in the future, and all the music in it is from the 20th and 21st centuries, which the characters sort of lump everything together, right? They think of all music, everything from the blues through rock and roll, through pop music, through rap, all as being one kind of music, right? In the same way that you or I might think that like Mozart, Brahms, and Beethoven are all one kind of music, even though they span a very large amount of time in a lot of different styles.
Yeah.
And so when I keyed on into having music being an element of the book, that allowed me to it gave me a little bit of a structure, right? Because then instead of it just being chapter 1 it was chapter 1 and the title of a song, or chapter 2, etc. And then that also, that started off, sometimes I would have the chapter, again, this is improvisational, but I would have the chapter in mind, and I would think, okay, what's a song that I could put in this section? And then other times I would find I was inspired by the music. Like I would think about the music and I'd think, okay, well, there's going to be this scene that is that's about the conflict breaking out, and I'd be, okay, well, what songs could I do? And and for that chapter 7, I hit on like Life During Wartime by Talking Heads, which is a band I really liked. And then that kind of the sometimes the lyrics or the way that the music was done would influence the way I structured the chapter, or some of the imagery I would use, things like that. Not to say it's not like my book and my process is not like hyper analytical. I don't have a systematic way of approaching everything, but I definitely was allowed myself to be inspired by the musical selections that were in there.
Wow, it really sounds like you kind of like stumbled into the music theme and then just it kind of slowly overtook the book, which is very interesting. You're right, it's very improvisational again. That seems to be a theme with your work. That's very interesting to me. I was just going to ask real quick, actually, Fahad, you could take this, the color question.
Yeah, so sort of about so I was, when we were doing the research about the book, this was we read that it was originally released as single issues, and then each issue had its own color scheme, and for the English language release, you've kind of chosen to go with one color scheme. I think it's only chapter 7 which goes into kind of like a black and white, but for the rest of the book it's kind of red, white and black. So I was just wondering why you decided to kind of make that change from the original single issues to the to kind of like the English language graphic novel.
Sure. Two things. On the most basic level, it's an economic decision, right? Because the individual issues, they can be like, pink and blue and orange and everything. Like I can change each issue, and it doesn't cost any more, right? It's the same cost. Whereas if each chapter in the book was a different color, it would be really expensive compared to doing it all in black and white and the spot color, which is kind of a rosy pink color. Yeah. So there's just the economics of it. There's a part of me that would have loved to have every chapter be different, because I did play with that in the serialized issues, where sometimes I would have the colors affect or reflect on the storyline, like what was going on. So that could be a really cool version of the book. But there is something, I think, to be said for having a structural unity of the book where everything is the same. Like it's like a big brick of pink and black and white, and it's kind of calm, and it doesn't get in the way, I hope, of the reader. Right? You can read it, and you probably will notice the pink color, or in the French edition, the purple color. But after a while, you'll just kind of register it as that third tone. But it does color the way, no pun intended, it does color the way that you read the story. And so, yeah, I like that element of it.
That's yes. It's, I find that kind of like fascinating. I was thinking maybe it was kind of like an editorial decision that you'd made, because I realized you've been creating this story for a long time, so I thought maybe it was kind of like well, let's go in a slightly different direction. But it does come down to comic books being quite expensive to make, trying to kind of make sure like it's economical to sell, I suppose.
I think so. And like that's one of the classic things in comic books. Comic books have often been limited by the technology of the time, and I like that. There's a reason why I don't. I work in full color sometimes when I do illustrations and things like that. But I really like this kind of spot color technique, which comes from, a background in printmaking, and it comes from like a real appreciation of like the history of printmaking. Because once upon a time, it was very expensive to have stuff in full color. We live in a much more full color world than we ever have with screens and everything. But even when I was a kid and before that, I remember there would be like the section in the newspaper, and it would be black and white and red, or black and white and some color. And that's because it costs a lot less to do that than to do full color. And then you get the aesthetics of that, right? Like there's a certain look that you get with a spot color, and I really like that. So I don't mind being restrained a little bit by finances. I think it sometimes it can be the restraint that allows you to find the style that works for you.
Yeah. I've got one more question about kind of the book. So in terms of like the politics of the book, kind of, I know I was reading back through your previous interview, and I know the germ of the idea of Titan came from when you saw like a big dog interacting with a little dog, and I was just wondering kind of what kind of germinated the idea of like the politics that went through the story, or was that kind of again something very improvisational?
Yeah, well, no, I mean, like you said, like the basic idea was just, I was like, oh, what if there were big people? It's a really simple idea, but I was like, well, what if there were big people? Like, what would affect? How would that affect us? And so from there, I kind of, I didn't want to draw a fantasy story with fantasy giants or anything like that. So I'm just trying to come up with some kind of way that's somewhat logical that these giants would exist. And so then I came up with the idea of people in space in low gravity, and then that made me like that natural tendency that we maybe have is, as a species, I don't know, for like the other. There's a lot of othering that happens in our societies where like the workers are one group of people, the management is another group of people. Like people of one race are one group of people, there's another race, and they have conflict between them. And so to me, it was very natural that these giant people and the quote unquote normal people, the people from the earth, would have some sort of tension. They would have a natural state of tension existing. And that's what lent itself to the idea of like there's being a worker conflict. And I come from a very working class background myself, and I have studied a lot about it. And so that definitely just sprang to mind as a natural lens to view the story through. And then I wanted it to be, I didn't want it to just be about conflict either. So I wanted it to be about a connection, but about people from different sides of a conflict who are connected in one way or another, for good and for ill. It's not exactly like a rosy and all optimistic story. There, I think it's relatively realistic, and there's some like sad stuff that happens, but it also has a glimmer of hope, I think, too, as well at the same time. So yeah, that's where that came from. It's super crazy, because like you said, this book came out in 2017, and I started writing it 5 years before that. So say in 2012 is when I came up with the idea. I came up with the ideas before that, but I started writing it in 2012. It came out in 2017, and it's wild to me. It's coming out in 2020, and a lot of these issues, there's these moments of public protest and like extreme police violence and like racial and ethnic tensions in this book. And it's really wild for it to be coming out in this year, like 2020. I feel like it's going to be a very historical. It feels already very historical, right? It's like it's just halfway done, and it feels out of control. So we'll see. But I can't believe that the book is coming out right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something both myself and Cole really enjoyed about the book. Was at the heart is kind of this this tender relationship between the two protagonists, but then there are these sweeping themes about exploring capitalism and exploitation and revolutionary myths and all this sort of thing. So yeah.
Right. Well, we're all caught in it, right? Like we're all caught in the middle of history at all times, and so us and these characters, they're just kind of floating along, and in this big giant river, and maybe they can affect the river, but a lot of the times the river is affecting them.
So you were talking about earlier, you didn't want to do fantasy giants and stuff like that. So I'm kind of curious because there's a few fantastical elements to the story, but on average, I would say it's very grounded and quite personal. So I'm wondering why take the sci-fi angle? What is it that called to you from the sci-fi genre instead of fantasy or instead of straight modern fiction?
Oh, sure. Well, yeah. Some people have mentioned that this book could basically be, set in like a mine today, or in 1892 or something like that. And I don't mind that. I don't mind that, because to me that's a sense that overall it's fairly grounded. But the reason I love fantasy. I grew up reading. Like Lord of the Rings and playing Dungeons and Dragons and things like that. I like that escape that you get in fantasy. But overall, and more as I've gotten older, I find that I'm more attracted to and find science fiction a little more interesting. And I think one of the main reasons I find myself attracted to it is because there's a link. There's a link with our world. And in this comic, for instance, there's a link in the sense that like they listen to music that's from our world. It's it's not like Star Wars, right, where it's set in a fantasy universe, and they listen to fantasy music and like everything's aliens and things like that. There's a lot of connections with our world, and to me, I think that is how would I say it? That's a very powerful tool to be able to use, right? Because it allows there to be these very direct connections with everything. It's not sometimes it's the things aren't metaphorical, right? There's a metaphorical element to the book where these giants are standing in for like oppressed peoples or workers around the world. At the same time, there's also like a sense of continuity of history, right? Like because everything that's happening in our world right now happened in the past of the world of Titan. So there's like the knock-on effects and things are kind of traveling down. So that's one of the reasons I find myself really attracted to science fiction for this story and for lots of other stories. It's just that sense of the connection to our real world.
Very cool. So speaking about your personal tastes here, I do have a question, just not really related to Titan, but I'm wondering, what are some of your favorite comics? Like what got you as a kid maybe, or whenever you started reading, what kind of like pushed you to want to do comics? What's that thing that you love about comics?
Yeah, sure. Well, I like a lot of people. I started reading comics when I was a kid. I would read the Spider-Man newspaper strips at the public library, or all Garfield. I was a big Garfield fan. That kind of thing. And then I grew up in the I was a teen during the 1990s. So I was definitely very much influenced by the huge boom that was happening in the 1980s and 1990s in comics, and that's both on the mainstream side and on the indie side. So on the mainstream side, like that was the time where the big superstars like Jim Lee and Todd McFarlane and everything were making huge inroads into the pop culture consciousness, both first with their work at Marvel and then later when they founded Image. And that was like a big deal, right? Like that suddenly made it so that like more people were reading comics. So I definitely was influenced by all that. When I was really young, I really loved Jim Lee. I thought he was just like the best. It's kind of interesting. I think he is really good, but I don't like to look at Jim Lee's work anymore, and it's not interesting to me anymore. But when I think back to when I was like 12, 13 years old, I was just obsessed with the way he drew. But then at the same time, like there was this huge turnover in the 80s and 90s where, I think it kind of broke with like say something like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but there was just a ton of indie and kind of more mature work across the spectrum. So somebody like Jeff Smith, who was doing Bone, was a big influence on the way I thought about comics, and opened me up to a lot of like thinking about how to draw and and pace action on the page. Paul Pope, who did THB, was a comic I was really into when I was younger, and then all that kind of led me into the Vertigo comics, and then the more indie alternative scene. So that people like Dan Clowes, Charles Burns, Jaime Hernandez, um, they Julie Doucet, they're all these people who are more on the kind of literary tip of things, and so I think that comes across a little bit in my work and the way I kind of think about things, because I really like that. I like literature. I like literary stories. I like something a little bit more mature, but I also, I have this grounding where I really like, I grew up reading superhero comics, and so I like action, and I like fight scenes, and I like spaceships and things like that. And I think you see that a little bit in Titan, the melding of those two worlds.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of those things, kind of, as you mature, sort of, again, as someone who grew up in kind of like the in the 90s, kind of like, one of my favorite movie stars was like Jean-Claude Van Damme. And now those are like deeply silly action films, and you do kind of mature out of that a little bit, but at the same time, I still love a good kind of like action film, but I need a little bit more from it. I think, like you said, as you grow up, kind of what brings you into comic books kind of matures as your tastes mature. So yeah, definitely, I can, everything you kind of mentioned about kind of needing a story with themes, but having also, you can have that story, but also have it with like spaceships and fights and that sort of thing as well. So yes, it's quite interesting that that reflected in the way you created the book.
Well, like on the film side of things, you mentioned Jean-Claude Van Damme, which I definitely have watched my full share of Jean-Claude Van Damme movies. I and Universal Soldier, pretty deep ideas there, but that made me think of I think it's called Haywire, which is a movie by Steven Soderbergh, who's one of my favorite directors.
Yes,
And
Gina Carano.
but
Yeah.
right, like, and it's like it's like the same stuff, right? It's just like this badass action stuff, but then it's all filtered through a more sophisticated sensibility. And there's some like kind of like you know even though it's really like a popcorn flick, there's a lot of like there's some deeper things there. You can kind of like it kind of percolates a little more. That's one of the reasons why I like him as a director, and I kind of come back to him a lot, is because he's often tackling these kind of rather genre esque themes in his films, and yet he does it with this sensibility that I really like, and that really speaks to me. So yeah.
Yeah. Just another quick question about sort of comic book. What comics are you kind of reading at the moment in terms of like creators or genres and that sort of thing?
Yeah. I mean, there's let's see. Well, as far as some creators that I really like, on the American scene, somebody that I really like is a mainstream cartoonist, Chris Samney.
My God.
And yeah, to me, he's just great. He is the ne plus ultra of like how I could imagine a really well drawn, well paced comic, and I find myself going back to his work and looking at it over and over and over. And to me, he's the I would say he's like one of the very, very best people illustrating comics, and he's writing now too. And I find his writing interesting as well, because again, he's doing genre work, but he has a little bit. There's a little bit of something, a little depth there, but really purely on the visuals. To me, he's the number one on the American scene. And I read a lot of. I live in Montreal in Canada now, and so I'm a little bit more in the kind of French Canadian Franco Belgian kind of mode, where I end up reading a lot of those kind of comics too. Um, some people who I really like there are Carrascoet, which is a couple actually. They're a wife and a husband who they draw together under one pen name, and they did a book called Beauty and another book called Beautiful Darkness and a book called Miss Don't Touch Me, and those were all really great. And they have a sort of cartoony style, but they can really do almost anything. Especially, I think they have complementary art styles that they bring to the page. They're really inspiring to me, and they're not writers. They draw. They're visual storytellers. They're artists, but they've tended to work with some really good authors who have created these fantastic and very nuanced and complicated stories with them. Oftentimes, the stories have a little bit of almost a childlike look to them, or a fairy tale look, but they're super dark, twisted, but that not in a boring way, like a really deep and emotional way. I love their stuff. And another person who I have been reading more of lately, and I want to read more of, is I believe he's Swiss. His name is Frederick Peters.
Oh my God. I just read almost all of his work. He is incredible.
Yeah. I've the things I've read from him are Amma and Lupus, and I really like both of those. So I'm looking forward to reading more of his stuff.
I would recommend real quick The Smell of Starving Boys by him.
Okay.
He works with a writer. I believe it might be an Asian American writer. I can't remember, but it is, yeah, next to Amma, that's my favorite work by him.
Cool.
It's incredible, yeah.
That's awesome.
I tend to, so that I live in the UK, and we did a UK comics creator survey, and kind of like the results from that, kind of like the financial reality of trying to run a small press comics company. It was kind of not surprising, but it was still depressing to kind of like read it. So like, the amount of money that, especially here in the UK, that just if you're trying to make money from comics is quite challenging. So just, you spoke a little bit about the Belgium thing. I'm just cognizant of time as well. What's the comic scene like in Canada, and how is it different from the sort of like scene in the USA in terms of the stories being told and the size of the scene and stuff like that?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'll just mention is something that you mentioned, which is on the financial side of things. I will say that it is kind of definitely easier in some ways, because there is a lot more support for the arts. It's easier to get grants for things. It's easier to get support, and then also specifically here in Quebec, where I live. There's a specific sort of pride and energy that goes into French language products here, and books and movies and things like that. And because I think that the culture, they're surrounded by Anglophone English speakers on all sides in the United States and Canada. So they've tried really hard to support and facilitate the French language creative sector, and that comes across in comics as well. There's a lot of prizes and things, like specifically for French language comics from Quebec. Like, for instance, Titan was nominated for 6 awards, and I hope it does, but I'll be really surprised if it gets nominated for 6 awards in the U.S. market. You know what I mean? I don't even know if there are 6 awards in the U.S. market for comic books, and so I think that there's a lot of energy and financial energy that goes into it. There are really great organizations like the Canada Council that are supporting artists, giving people grants all across the spectrum, not just in comics, but in visual art, filmmaking, writing, everything like that. And then secondly, in the culture, the kind of work that's being made. Well, one thing I've noticed here is that number one, I was really lucky to fall into a really great group of creators here in Montreal. And I feel really just really lucky that I met the people I did, and they've been really supportive of me. But one thing I definitely noticed is that when I speak to a lot of the creators that I know here, they're often younger than me, but they've written like 2, 3, 4, 6 books, and I think about a lot of people who are in my generation in the United States, like indie cartoonists, and a lot of them have done one book, or maybe they don't even have their first book out. They've done some short stories, but they've been working on one book for 10 years, right? And they're not
Oh,
done with that book, and they really want it to be perfect, and so they keep coming back to it, and it just takes forever. And to me, like one of the things I think that is really great here in Quebec is the people, a lot of the cartoonists, they work on their thing, they finish it, they put it out, or it gets put out for them from a small publishing house or a big publishing house, and then they just move on to the next thing, and they keep getting better every time, and they're not worried about the thing being perfect or exactly the way that they have in this vision that they have in their mind as a creative. And that to me is one of the best lessons that I think I've learned here from the culture, and I really hope that I can bring that to my own creations. In fact, I know I did, because it took me 5 years to work on Titan, but in the I drew the last half of it, so it's 200 pages. I drew the last 100 pages in 1 year, and I think I drew probably the last 3/4 in 2 years or something like that. So basically, the first 3 years of working on Titan was the first quarter of the book, like say 50 pages in 3 years. It's ridiculous, And then by the end, I was cranking out 100 pages in 1 year, and then the next book I did, I didn't write it, so it was easier, but I did 160 pages in I don't know, less than a year, like something like 10 months or something. And so, there I do have, like, I look at the art and I look at or my writing and things like that, and I want to fix it. I'm like, oh, it's not perfect, it's not as good as I could make it, but I'm starting to just learn to let it go, right? I don't know who said it, but there's a famous saying that paintings are never finished, they're just abandoned. And I think that is like, it's a good sense, you have to just stop working on something sometimes.
kind of like a lot of what you've just said kind of like speaks directly into my heart, because like somebody who writes, it's just kind of like this kind of like internal sort of like self-flagellation where you just kind of like, oh, well, that sentence could be a little bit better, but yeah, exactly, just crank it out, and just get on the page and to produce something. So yeah, it's kind of like a lot of what you said struck a chord with me there.
Oh, good. Well, I hope it's helpful. You can get back to me if it's bad advice down the line.
Cole, I think you've got the next question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, since it has been so long since you started Titan, how has the work evolved, and has it taken a life of its own? Is it still on your mind, or I guess you are saying you kind of have moved on since finishing it?
Well, I think so. At every stage I was re-editing and redoing some things, and so like I don't think that that's too hypocritical when I say at the top, I say that people just need to do the work and get it out there and not worry so much about it, because I did do a lot of edits, and I fixed a lot of things all throughout the process, even including in this new version that's coming out with Oni. There were things that I didn't that I thought I could improve, and so I fixed it. I did some rewrites. I did a little bit of redrawing. I drew a couple new pages to add some things to it. But so it's always on my mind, like how I can and make the book better. But now I think the book's done. Like it's going to come out. It's coming out like in book format in English. I would be very surprised if I do any more edits to it. And I am trying to move on to other comics, other ideas. I have a new graphic novel of my own that I'm working on, where I'm writing it and drawing it. Another science fiction graphic novel, and that's at the very early stages. But I'm really excited about that. So I kind of put a lot of my thought process into that at this point. I did this too when I was working on Titan. Sometimes when I go to bed, a lot of times I'll read when I go to sleep, but sometimes when I go to bed and I don't feel like reading or something, I'll just sit there and I'll just try and think about the comic that I'm doing, or the story that I'm doing. And so I would like I'll repeat the title to myself, like as I'm falling asleep, and then I'll have ideas, like I'll do it on a long road trip or something like that. So now I've moved on. I'm no longer like repeating the title Titan to myself as I go to sleep. I repeat new titles and new ideas to try and kind of stimulate my ideas. So try and move beyond that.
So you've kind of already answered that, the question already. It sounds like you're working on a new science fiction novel. So kind of in terms of what have you been working on lately?
Oh yeah. Well, in addition to that, that's still at the early stages. And in addition to that, I have a kind of a day job in comics where I'm drawing a monthly comic book, which is a sort of sci-fi comedy thing. And I can't talk about it too much because it hasn't officially been announced, but it's going to come out in 2021. And it's kind of really exciting because it's a monthly comic. It's like a comic book that's going to be in comic book stores. It'll end up being collected, but it's not like a graphic novel. And I feel like it's getting me back to my old roots of reading, say like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or Usagi Yojimbo or something like that. There's a lot of action and comedy and stuff in it. So yeah, that's what I'm working on right now. Unfortunately, I can't talk about it too much more than those vague details, but that's my day job. I work on it every day, and I have to draw a lot. I draw 6 pages a week to do that comic, and so
Wow.
yeah, it's So I'll be honest. Sometimes I fall behind, but that's my pace that I'm supposed to be doing, and yeah, it's fun. It's a wild project, and I think it's going to reach a different kind of audience than my previous books have. And then on the French side, I'm going to be doing the sequel to the collaborative book I did, 13th Avenue, which is like a YA kids mystery sort of story that was written by Genevieve Peterson and came out from La Pastèque. And so I'll be doing at least 1 or 2 more volumes of that. I'm just waiting on the story. Like when I get the story from that, that's when I'll start that. So those will be not super soon, but in the next couple of years, I'm sure that those are that sequel is going to be coming out too.
That sounds really, really exciting.
Yeah, I'm really happy you got more work coming out, honestly. I was worried that since this is finally coming out, you might be taking a break and sitting back. I'm so happy that there's more stuff coming from you.
Well, I was really lucky, as soon as Titan was finished, I had an offer to do 13th Avenue as the illustrator, and I didn't have to write it and create the story from scratch. So it was great. I could just jump right into it, because for me, the writing is the hardest part, and creating the kind of like the concepts for the story and things like that. And then that gave me a little bit of space to work on my own writing and work on these different stories. The only thing is now I need more space because I'm really lucky. I have a lot of sort of drawing gigs, but I need more mental space to write. But I'll figure some way to get that in the coming year.
That's
awesome.
Sounds fantastic. I think that's kind of all the stock questions that we'd written. Cole, is there anything that you want to ask Francois?
Really not much I can think of. It's kind of a broad question, but for a closer, what do you think after this? I mean, I'm sure no one knows, but after all this craziness, what do you see as like the future of comics? Like, are we moving towards a digital only type thing, do you think? Or maybe going away from the single issue as a reader or as a creator? What are kind of your opinions on that?
Sure. I mean, it really depends on the genre of the story and the kind of book that you're going to be reading. I'm working on a monthly comic, and so I think that there definitely is like a huge potential audience for monthly comics. And I read monthly comics my whole life. I will say that for me personally, in the last 10 years or more, I have bought less and less monthly comics, and I definitely gravitate more towards like full books or full collections. And I think that is probably an industry-wide trend that's just going to be that's just going to continue. I think that there's always going to be a certain market for the floppies, as they call them, the individual issues. But I think in some ways that audience is. I've worked in a comic book store before, and I think that there's nothing bad about that audience, but that is an audience that's already been turned on to comics at some point in their life. They read comics when they were kids, or one of their parents turned them onto it, or a friend, or something like that. and that's a small part of the audience. The much bigger audience, and I think that's really obvious in kind of the big publishing houses and things like that. The much bigger potential audience is in the book trade, be it digitally or I think just in books. Books can be printed and mailed to people all around the world. I love bookstores, and I really hope that they can tough it out. And there are some really cool options. Like there's a new one called bookshop.org that allows you to order books online, and the proceeds go to the independent bookstore of your choice that has an account. That's really great. I love stuff like that. But I will say that books are, you can enjoy them from the comfort of your home. You can while your city is in confinement, or, if you're doing social distancing and things like that, you can still read books. There's nothing like this thing that we're all missing out on, right? Of comic conventions and going to the bookstore and meeting people, or just meeting up with your friends and talking about things that you like. But I do think that the medium and the art form is always going to, it's well positioned to always exist.
Yeah. It's really interesting what you kind of mentioned about kind of bookshops. I was on the comic survey kind of chat. They did a Zoom call to kind of like discuss what should be done to kind of help develop the scene here in the UK. And one of the things that they mentioned was that, maybe try and talk to bookshops about not having a graphic novel section, except just putting graphic novels in with like the rest of the books,
mm-hmm.
and see if people actually pick them up and read them. Because kind of, if you've got a autobiographical book, there's so many great autobiographical graphic novels. Why not just stick them in the autobiographical section? So it's kind of like, trying to think about audience development and things like that, kind of moving away from the sort of quote unquote traditional comic book reading.
And we're gonna have to just do all sorts of different experiments in all the different markets and things like that. People can't stop. People can't stop doing things, and as much as I'm kind of an old-fashioned person, I love the old ways of books and the book trade and the way I grew up reading and things like that. But there's no question that the comic book industry, that the book industry it has to keep evolving, because the world is changing. But at the same time, I think people love books. I think people love reading, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Yeah. So I think just a couple of more, just a couple of things. Is there anything that we haven't asked you that we should have?
No, not necessarily. I did actually. I was just because I know that you guys have you read the book, and I remember you kind of like gave a lot of. I listened to your episode about the book. Thank you. And I remember you kind of gave a lot of details about the plot. Do you? I don't know if I've listened to an interview on your podcast yet, but do you guys do like a spoiler section or anything like that? If you want to, we can. If you have any like kind of spoilery questions, we can kind of cordon those off into their own little section at the end if you want to.
So this is the first interview that we've done.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of, we're still figuring out how to do it, and I think I don't know why we didn't decide to kind of. But I think we did quite an in-depth review where we discussed what happened in the book. I don't know why we didn't decide to do that, Cole.
Yeah, we do a spoiler warning usually for our reviews, because we kind of we don't plan to spoil things, but we kind of often end up spoiling things. But we were kind of being careful this time because the book isn't, I guess, out yet, even though we've read it. So we were kind of tiptoeing a bit.
Perfect.
But,
that's fine.
I don't know if I have any spoiler questions for you, considering I've had so long to think about the book. I think I kind of got all I wanted out of it, honestly.
That's perfect. No stress. I just wanted to make sure.
I have one final question. What was the most challenging part of the book in terms of writing for you?
The most challenging part of the book in terms of writing.
If you can think of it. If
not.
Yeah.
No, that's a really good question. I think it was kind of connecting the dots, because I would have ideas about kind of plots and subplots, and because as we talked about, it was sort of improvisational. Sometimes I would have ideas, and then I would have to think, okay, well, I mentioned this thing in this earlier chapter. Is there any way that I can bring that around so that it thematically makes sense with the rest of the book? And so sometimes that was a lot of the creative thinking in it, right? Is that I had already created something, and then I needed to make it pay off, but I didn't know how. I didn't have a plan when I started the concept. And then so making that stuff pay off, that was probably the biggest challenge. And I think I was moderately successful in kind of like tying up the loose ends and kind of tying up everything in a little bow at the end of the book. But I think that's the biggest challenge, and one of the biggest challenges, I think, of having a more improvisational kind of approach to it.
Very good answer. I read something recently. One of the writers I really like, Jonathan Hickman, American comic writer. Mm-hmm. He talks about that very similar thing. He says you have to create the illusion that A and B, you've known the answer to A with B the whole time, but you've just revealed it to the reader. But honestly, he never knows. And it's just about creating that, like, I knew the whole time type of feelings that brings out that big revelation in the plot. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at there. Like, you've laid the groundwork, and now you just have to figure out how to connect it while the reader thinks you knew all along. I thought that was a very interesting technique.
Right, and I'm sure, I mean, for him, he's juggling these gigantic things with the Marvel Universe and, all these different characters and things like that. And I'm sure that is an element in a lot of the people who are doing these big, kind of like superhero comics or something. There is that chance that you can kind of surprise yourself, or you can pick up on something that you didn't realize you had done at an early point. Like, for instance, I'll do a little tiny spoiler. So for those viewers or listeners who are very concerned, this is a micro spoiler. But the main character in the book, he has a computer in his head, and it's called it's his I, lowercase I, which is a pretty clear reference to something like an iPhone or something like that. And so I always knew he had a computer in his head, and I always knew that the computer was going to not work at some point, right? Like that it was going to stop working. And I had all these ideas about, like, computer virus or something like that. But then I was like, oh, it can be in his eye. Like the eye can be in his eye. And like when you pull out, they take the computer, he has his computer surgically removed from his head, and it's his eye that's gone. And so it's a pun, it's like a little joke. But I didn't know that when I wrote the concept. Or like the first 4 chapters of the book, I'm like talking about his I, lowercase I, in his head. But I never had the concept that it was going to be this little joke that was going to have like this big visual payoff, right? Because by doing that, then I'm allowed to do some kind of gross horror visual elements to deal with this eyeball trauma that happens a little bit late in the book. That's the spoiler for those of you who are worried about it. I'm not going to spoil anything else. Yeah. But yeah, so I didn't know, like I had no idea. And then but I think that most readers who read that, like if they notice it at all, they'll be like, oh, I see, like it's foreshadowed that the eye is foreshadowed by the fact that it's called his eye, but it's not. I just made it up.
That was good payoff. And that I love that you call it a joke, because when I first read that, I was like, oh, I get the pun. Oh God, what are they doing to his eyeball? And it was like, for a second it was funny, and then it was horrifying. That was a very quality scene. I like that.
Yeah.
Good.
François, is there anything else that you want to plug or talk about?
No, not at the moment. Like my big thing, my big focus is on Titan. It's coming out November 10th, and so that takes up a lot of my brain space when I'm not working on these books that are going to come out in 2021, 2022, etc. So, no, nothing else to plug. Thank you guys so much for your interest. It was I stumbled across your podcast, which I think is kind of new, and you guys had a lot of really nice things to say about my book, so I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
It was our pleasure.
Yes, it is our pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, and I think I've personally really enjoyed some of the answers you've given about the creative process and kind of what went into sort of getting a comic book from your head finally out onto onto the printed page.
Cool. Well, thank you guys.
Thanks for your time, man. It was a really fun conversation.